Hey y'all, we are back in the garden today and fall has officially and fully arrived. Gardening does not stop when summer ends, and there are some necessary fall preparation tasks that need to be done now in order to set you up for success next season. Fall prep can include several things in many steps, so I will be breaking up this video into two parts to focus on some very important things. In this video today, I will be discussing how I transplant some perennial plants, including 3 of my berry bushes and some herbs. I did mention in a previous video where I want to relocate my berry bushes. I have 2 raspberries and 1 blueberry, and I talked about how I want to relocate them inside the garden and put them in the ground. I'm going to start with the harder task first, which is getting these berry bushes in the ground. So let's get started.
Late September to mid-October is a great time to transplant perennials in the ground because it gives them a little time to get established before the hard frost rolls in. Currently, we are expecting our first frost, which is typically a lighter frost, around October 15th or so. So I prefer to get them into the ground prior to that so they can be better acclimated. Looking at the weather now, we may actually not get our frost around October 15th, so we will see. However, you can transplant perennials as long as the ground is still workable, which is about until late December or January for us in Zone 6B. Perennials do go dormant, so there won't be much, if any, growth during this time as the plant is in rest mode. So we don't have to worry about shocking the perennial or damaging any part of the plant. To prepare the plant, what you'll also see me do is gently press on the grow bags or rotate them to loosen the root ball so it's easier to remove them from the bag. I don't want to risk breaking a branch by pulling on them too hard to get them out of the bag. This poor plant needs all the foliage it can get to survive the winter because right now it is already looking very sparse and very straggly. So I'm trying to maintain the integrity of the plant during this process. Like I said earlier, in a previous video, I positioned my 2 raspberry bushes and my 1 blueberry bush inside the garden where I plan to transplant them permanently. Berry bushes always do best when in the ground, and this is long overdue for these plants. I've had these plants for a few years now. One of the raspberry bushes I got just last year, so I'm relieved to finally get them in the ground. Berry bush roots are also rather shallow, so I don't need to spend all day digging huge holes for them. I just dig a few inches wider than the root ball and clear out some of the old soil that they've been living in for a couple years now. I do add fresh compost when burying the root ball, and I also sprinkle in some berry fertilizer and mix it in at the bottom before I put the bush inside of the hole I just dug. I have this berry tone or holly tone on hand that has worked really well in the past, so that is what I'm using today in this video. As you can see, it can help a number of plants, but I am mostly concerned about the blueberry and the raspberry, both of which are listed on the bag. So, like I said, it has worked well for me in the past. Now that the first raspberry bush is in, I am moving on quickly to my blueberry bush, which is much bigger in comparison. If your berry bushes have had a lot of growth, now is also the time to prune them. I have posted an older video, maybe a couple years back, reviewing how I specifically pruned this blueberry bush if you need a reference. With all of my transplants, I give it a thorough watering to help set the plant, and I do eventually mulch around the base to further protect it. Right now, the weather forecast is saying rain the day after I posted this video, so they do get a good watering eventually once the weather dips maybe into the 40s and 30s. That is when I do mulch heavily around the base. I typically mulch with dried out leaves or dried straw or hay, and both methods have worked well for me in the past. Just like these plants, we also go into rest mode during the winter months. Things slow down, maybe we aren't as active, and life is generally quieter for us during this time. I think it is very important to break up larger tasks into smaller, more manageable ones to avoid overexhaustion or overexertion. This can be helpful if you get overwhelmed with the amount of work that has to be done or if you have limited time. Fall, winter is a reminder that we also need a period of rest. That is essentially why I decided to break up all of my fall preparation tasks this year, because sometimes it can just be overwhelming to do everything in one weekend. So later on this month, I will be deconstructing a lot of the trellises. I will be working on overwintering a lot of plants. However, for today, I just want to get my berry bushes and my herbs established and into the ground, which for me, that is enough. I acquired this blueberry bush at the same time I acquired my other raspberry bush that I just planted. So they are both roughly about 4 years old or so. And like I mentioned, they've unfortunately been living in these grow bags for the entirety of the time that I've had them. At our previous location, we were renting, so I did not want to put them in the ground. Now that we have our established garden, I do want to put them in the ground. However, the raspberry bush, without fail, it dies every year, it dies all the way back, and it comes back just as strong in the spring. So I'm hoping with it being in the ground, it will become more established, like this blueberry bush. This blueberry bush, we've gotten hundreds of blueberries off of it, but because growth is slow and limited, I have not had to prune it in the past few years. Being in the grow bag, it doesn't really grow much. So again, hopefully with these plants in the ground, they will be doing much better and our yields will be much better. However, like I said with my raspberry bush, things weren't looking too good there when I planted it in the ground. It was, falling apart. A lot of the canes looked dead, but fingers crossed it will come back in the spring and thrive. I am just looking forward to having more berries in the garden, more fruit, because who doesn't love a good jam? Dylan and I actually do just like them as is, of course. Dylan's favorite is blueberries, but he also loves red raspberries. We do not have any black raspberries because we, I guess, aren't as much of a fan compared to the red raspberry, so why bother growing them? Perennials are generally hardy plants, and some can tolerate being relocated a couple times throughout their life. However, you do want to be strategic with where you're relocating it to. You want to make sure that the plant will ultimately be happy in the new location. So we need to consider the amount of sunlight they need, the soil or type of soil, pH, acidity it prefers, and the function of the plant. For example, I prefer to keep my perennial flowers in my front garden bed, like my hydrangeas near my peonies. So once the peony blooms come and go in the early summer, I know that the hydrangea blooms will soon follow. Ideally, I get those blooms or the blossoms throughout the entirety of the summer, even early into the fall. There are some perennials that can also be divided. After a few years of growth, they of course get bigger and bigger, and you could divide them like irises. So you may not have to dig up the whole plant. It's important to know what type of perennial it is and what you can do with it. But typically, it is always easier to transplant perennials when they are younger and they are smaller. Luckily, this blueberry bush isn't too difficult for me to manage, but I anticipate that if it were any larger, it would be much more difficult for me to transplant and relocate. The blueberry bush is just about finished up, so now I will be moving on to my last raspberry bush and my herb bed. I'm hoping that this raspberry bush will do well tucked away in the corner next to my herb raised bed. It is a strawberry shortcake variety, and it actually produced a few berries this season, and they were so sweet and tart. I'm very happy with that purchase last year from my garden center, so it's a relatively young plant. It was also labeled as a good patio or pot plant to be kept in a pot, so I think it will do well in a smaller, tighter space over here. We did have a dry spell the past couple of weeks, so the leaves are looking a little brown and crispy, but there is still some green. I'm hoping it will transplant well and make it through the winter, but one thing I have found out about raspberry plants is that they are quite resilient. And just when you think they've about died, again, similar to how this one looks right now, they burst out of the ground in spring and grow fast. I have noticed this with wild raspberry varieties and store-bought ones, like the ones that I have currently. Just like with my first two plants, I am preparing to transplant this one into the ground. I'm just digging a rather shallow hole, a few inches wider than I anticipate the root ball to be. I will sprinkle in some Hollytone fertilizer. You can really use any fertilizer as long as you know it's okay to be using for berry bushes. I mix the fertilizer in with some fresh compost, fresh soil, and I just tuck it in nice and neat with some soil on top. This raised bed you see here is where I want to consolidate and keep all of my perennial herbs into one location. At the other end of the raised bed, not where you can see, is where I have some asparagus, and this end, where you can see, is where I want to keep all of my perennial herbs. So the bush in the front is oregano. Behind that, in the smaller pot, is some rosemary. I do have a larger pot of rosemary, and then the medium-sized pot is some mint I was recently gifted. I have not grown mint before, but I have heard that you want to keep it controlled in a pot because it can be quite invasive and grow into and choke out other plants. Right now, we are not huge mint users or eaters, so I'm going to keep it in this pot probably for a while. The other perennial herbs that I forgot to mention are my chives, which I also keep in a pot. Those you can divide year after year. They get bigger and bigger, and they slowly start to take over where you plant them. So I have kept those in a pot. I also have a very large pot of thyme that, again, gets bigger and bigger. So what I will be doing today is taking the big thyme out of the pot and planting it into the raised bed. And this, of course, is my kitty cat Chowders. She's coming to supervise.
Are you checking my work? How's it look?
Back to the herbs. The oregano I have found can sometimes be overwintered, meaning it survives the winter and grows back well in the spring. Or in my case, sometimes it dies, and luckily I save the seeds that come from the pretty purple flowers it grows in the fall, and I replant it in the spring. I have had some luck in the past where it does come back, and last year or the year before that it did not. So last year I brought it inside and it died anyway, but luckily I do save the seeds. However, with the rosemary bush, I have found that mine are never able to be overwintered. They are considered a perennial and are rather hardy. However, any rosemary plant, no matter how big it was, it dies back in the winter, and I ultimately just have to start growing it from seed again. So what I've been doing is bringing the rosemary plants inside, and then in the spring I bring them back outside. I know some people who might like to repot it. They will take it out of the pot come the spring and plant it in the ground throughout the summer and fall. Take it out of the ground, put it back into a pot to bring it inside. Some people have good luck with rosemary. I, for some reason, have not, so it's still a work in progress. Now that my last berry bush is in the ground and I'm just about finished, I can finally move on to my thyme. Here is my thyme in all her glory. I did have to take her out of the pot off camera because it's a huge pot and I was just really having a hard time. I'm just, I guess, not so gently trying to break up the root ball, but like I said, it's a very hardy plant. I have had this thyme for a few years now, and it is the most hardy plant I have owned. It just gets bigger and bigger each year, and it overflows the pot that it was in, even when not in the most ideal conditions. I kept that plant in that pot for years in the same soil for the past couple of years since we moved, so I don't know how, but it's managed to get even bigger. When I cook with the thyme, I either trim it and use it fresh, or I dry it and store it in a little glass jar. It stores really well. I don't have anything special like a dehydrator. I just let them air dry hanging upside down for a few days, and that seems to work well. So I'm going to transplant it here with the rest of the herbs in its permanent location, and like the berry bushes, I'll add some fresh compost and mulch, and hopefully I will have this plant for many more years to come. I hope this video was helpful, and I look forward to completing the rest of my fall chores another day. Thanks for following along, and happy gardening!